consequential strategic competitor for the United States now and for decades to come. One major source of tension, Taiwan. The island democracy is supported by the U.S., but China considers it a breakaway province and has vowed to use force if necessary to unify. Nick Schifrin recently traveled to the American Military Command in the Pacific, tasked with preparing for any future conflict with China.
300 miles off the coast of Hawaii, the shooters and the F-18 are ready. Pilots fly off the U.S.'s oldest operational aircraft carrier to try and guarantee what the U.S. calls a free and open Indo-Pacific, an area that covers half the planet's surface. We flew here on a cargo plane designed to land on carriers, invited by Indo-Pacific Command to see what the military calls the Joint Force, how each military service contributes to the fight.
I consider the aircraft carrier and the strike group the cornerstone of the Joint Force, frankly.
Navy Rear Admiral Christopher Sweeney commands the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group that typically deploys with a half-dozen ships. It's one of the U.S.'s most visible projections of power that could one day help deter China from attacking Taiwan.
Hopefully the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, recognizes that, and that we're just making them think like this is not the day that they want to do that.
USS Nimitz has more than 5,000 sailors, 70 jets, including F-18s. But the Chinese have made sure that this carrier is vulnerable by producing some of the most advanced missile systems on the planet.
In 2021, the People's Liberation Army tested more missiles than the rest of the world combined. China's arsenal is designed to make the U.S. think twice before defending Taiwan and to keep U.S. ships away. A Defense Department map shows anti-ship missiles with a range of 1,200 miles. A Chinese state-owned aerospace company even created a propaganda animation showing its missiles destroying an aircraft carrier.
I think about it each and every day, every second, because when I left the pier, I told my wife the only thing I cared about is that I brought every sailor back safe.
There's a lot of people who worry that carriers are sitting ducks. What do you think?
Yeah, so I would say I can maneuver, right? I just don't sit in one spot in the ocean. It's a pretty big ocean. It's pretty hard to target something in the ocean. I hear that a lot, like the carrier's at risk. Air bases don't move very fast the last time I checked. So that's sort of a joke, but not.
That's a reference to U.S. Air Force bases. Today, there are 9 main Pacific bases. The Air Force plans to use more small bases in the future because a more distributed footprint could complicate Chinese war planning. Colonel Jared Pasley is the Pacific lead for a program designed to execute that plan.
I think carriers, aircraft, everything is vulnerable. No bones about it. We're tied to the ground. And if you only have so many main operating bases forward, especially in host nations and partners, that makes the targeting calculus way too simple for an adversary. So we've got to get out, we've got to get distributed.
Protecting those distributed bases would be the job of the U.S. Army. On this day, these soldiers practice lifting and moving 9,300-pound artillery. In the Pacific, the Army will have to be able to island hop with their weapons, be able to set up quickly, and fire. The Army is developing longer-range missiles than it currently has that could better target Chinese ships, airfields, and command centers. And the Army deploys missile defenses to protect U.S. bases.
It's only the Army that provides those ground-based air defense capabilities at scale and at capacity.
Major General Brian Gibson leads the Army's 94th Air and Missile Defense Command. Last year, for the first time, his unit conducted the U.S.'s first live-fire exercises from Australia and Palau.
The ability to operate over greater expanded geographical distances is essential for the Joint Force and essential for us. You know, we live in a dangerous neighborhood.
How vulnerable are U.S. bases across the region?
Oh, they're all vulnerable to Chinese missiles.
Michael Swain directs the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute, a think tank that advocates restraint, and is a former senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. He says the U.S. in the Pacific is more vulnerable than it admits and needs to move faster to protect its bases. He also fears the U.S. is increasing its capabilities and capacity in the Pacific could lead to the very war it's trying to deter.
There is no magic bullet, no new technology that is going to be developed that will ensure that the United States can, without question, deter the Chinese from attacking Taiwan purely militarily. You need to have some level of real, credible reassurance on the one China policy. America's continued commitment to the notion that it's open to a peaceful, uncoerced, possible unification of China with Taiwan.
Swain is not alone in his skepticism.
I think we have to be quite careful about our actions because you can stumble into things.
Retired four-star Navy Admiral Michael Fallon was the commander here at Indo-Pacific Command from 2005 to 2007. The current commander, Admiral John Aquilino, invited him and every living former commander to celebrate the command's 75th anniversary.
Should the U.S. and China cooperate more?
In many ways, I think that's the right answer. But I think there's, from my view, far too much war talk, if you would, particularly around Washington.
Taiwan is increasing its defense spending and expanding its conscription, but many experts believe it's not doing enough. And Fallon questions whether the U.S. should come to Taiwan's defense until Taiwan proves it can defend itself.
In my opinion, there's a lot more they could do, and that would be helpful if their actions matched their aspirations, let's say.
A key part of the U.S. strategy to deter China is bolstering alliances with Pacific allies. Those allies are increasing their defense spending, and U.S. officials say they're more willing to discuss coming to Taiwan's aid. Retired Admiral Thomas Fargo was the commander here from 2002 to 2005.
The international community is what is going to deter China from taking action.
The U.S. military here wants to move faster to improve its capabilities to deter the People's Republic of China, or PRC. Retired Admiral Harry Harris was the U.S. ambassador to South Korea from 2018 to 2021 after serving as the commander here for 3 years.
As the PRC continues to improve its capabilities, improve its weapon systems, influence its partners, then we have to do the same and more, because we have to stay ahead of the PRC in all mission areas related to warfare.
In the waters of Pearl Harbor sits perhaps the best example of the U.S.'s staying ahead of the People's Republic of China in warfare. With a quick salute to the ship's namesake, Navy Commander Carlos Martinez walks me on board the USS Missouri. He leads the crew of a nuclear-powered fast-attack submarine that costs more than $3.5 billion to procure, and it's named for the battleship that hosted Japan's surrender.
This piece of teak here is a piece of teak that the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard got for us from the battleship Missouri.
The crew shows how they get a torpedo ready to launch.
Weapon entering tube!
Besides torpedoes that can attack ships, these Virginia-class submarines can carry cruise missiles to attack targets on land. It is the one system that experts agree is the most difficult to detect, and it can sail through what for the Chinese are the most sensitive waters.
If the operational commander tells me as a ship that he wants me to go to a certain area via a certain route that's international waters, then that's certainly within our right to do so.
Does that include the Taiwan Strait?
The international waters of the Taiwan Strait are available for navigation.
The U.S. calls China the only country with the intent and power to challenge U.S. influence long term. And so, regardless of any debate, the U.S. military is accelerating its posture in the Pacific. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin in Honolulu, Hawaii.
War with China would produce destruction on a scale unseen by the United States since 1945. China continues to strengthen its military and maintains the right to use force against Taiwan. U.S. officials warn that a Chinese invasion is a real possibility and imply that the U.S. would become involved in such a conflict. Although conflict is not inevitable, it is not impossible. CSIS conducted 24 wargame iterations of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The good news is that Chinese forces were unable to conquer the island, and Taiwan endured as an autonomous democracy. The challenges confronting a Chinese invasion are formidable. However, the costs were sobering. In 4 weeks of fighting, the United States typically lost hundreds of aircraft, 2 aircraft carriers, and up to 24 other ships. Bases on Guam were devastated. The Taiwanese economy suffered extensive damage. Japan was often dragged into the war and its bases attacked. China also took terrible losses, often including more than 100 warships and tens of thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Such a failure might endanger the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power. The war might last until exhaustion, producing an unstable peace with recurring conflict. The terrifying possibility of nuclear escalation also looms over any war involving two nuclear powers. The costs and risks for both sides strongly argue for avoiding war. Both will need to pursue political and diplomatic strategies that contribute to that end. For the United States and its allies, military deterrence will be a crucial part of that equation. How can that be achieved? The United States should harden bases, work with allies, particularly Japan, for additional basing options, continue to make its forces more survivable, and buy more long-range missiles, particularly anti-ship missiles, because some inventories are critically low. The Taiwanese can adopt the porcupine strategy, deploy more mobile anti-ship missiles, build a fully manned and highly capable army, and spend less on expensive and vulnerable ships and aircraft. Deterrence is possible and affordable, but it will require planning, some resources, and political will. For the full CSIS report, visit csis.org.
Tonight, the drumbeat of war. Taiwan says 28 Chinese warplanes, including fighter jets and nuclear-capable bombers, crossed into its airspace. As the tension between Taiwan and China is growing, and top military analysts warn that an invasion could cost many American lives. Oren Lieberman has this report you'll see first out front.
Taiwan is perhaps the most sensitive flashpoint between the U.S. and China. Some experts warning that Beijing's use of force to claim what it sees as its rightful territory is drawing closer. Chairman Xi Jinping has made it a priority for Beijing, which hasn't ruled out the use of force, a decision that could cost thousands of lives for China, Taiwan, and America. A war game from the Center for Strategic and International Studies begins with a Chinese missile barrage against Taiwan's military in 2026, destroying much of its air force and navy, followed by an amphibious invasion across the Taiwan Strait. Taiwanese forces fight back using advanced U.S. weaponry, Patriot missiles for air defense, anti-ship missiles and torpedoes for sea defense, and its ground forces to defend the beachheads.
Whatever the Taiwanese are going to fight the war with, they have to have that when the war begins.
In every scenario, China landed forces on Taiwan, but only in the most pessimistic cases does Beijing avoid defeat. But victory for the U.S. and Taiwan comes at a great cost. The war game assesses that the U.S. loses 10 to 20 combat ships, including 2 aircraft carriers, and 200 to 400 military aircraft. In 3 weeks of fighting, the U.S. suffers more than 3,000 troops killed in action. That's about half of what the U.S. suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan over 2 decades. America's global position is damaged for years. China loses 90% of its amphibious fleet and 52 major surface warships, and its Air Force loses more than 160 combat aircraft. Crucial to this outcome is the stockpile of precision-guided munitions. Taiwan would need more U.S.-supplied Harpoon anti-ship missiles, which may be in short supply because these missiles have been sent to Ukraine. The U.S. needs its own long-range anti-ship missiles, and this supply is one of the big risks.
It runs out within typically the first couple of days, and when that runs out, then the United States has to use shorter range munitions. Those can be effective, but it increases losses and increases risk.
China has the world's largest navy with about 340 ships and submarines compared to nearly 300 for the U.S. China's army has 1 million active duty service members, and it's the 3rd largest air force in the world. The top U.S. general says the key to avoiding conflict is deterrence.
As long as we remain number one, then we will deter the war that people worry about, a great power war between China and the United States.
Crucially, this war game does not ask the question of what would happen to make China decide to use military force to invade Taiwan. That remains an open question, especially given the united reaction of the West to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has crippled Russia's economy. Would China run the same risk, or would it use its industrial and economic power to control Taiwan instead of its military? And that, Aaron, is a critical question.
Well, in fact, where we are right now depends who you ask, because according to Beijing, this is actually part of China. Xi Jinping's #1 priority is to bring what he sees as a renegade province back under the control of the communist regime. And if Taiwan resists, he's made it abundantly clear that this modern, freewheeling democracy with a population similar to Australia's will become a bloody battlefield. What's happening here right now will shape the world for decades to come. And the fear is that this is where World War III could begin. This might look like an Army Special Forces bunker, but believe it or not, these are everyday Taiwanese who've decided to spend their weekend learning how to defend their country.
When give command target, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. Target! Unload, show clear.
In a nation with strict gun laws, these replica firearms are about as close as it's possible to get to the real thing. But with the looming threat of a possible Chinese invasion, the number of civilians signing up for weapons training courses here has skyrocketed. Do you think there's a chance China could invade your country?
That is why I keep training, because maybe someday, unfortunately, the invaders, I can quickly transform to real deal with not any big problems.
Monday to Friday, 24-year-old Ark Lu is a freelance photographer. But come the weekend, he's focusing his eye on something completely different.
I live here, I born here, and might be someday I die here. Yes, so I think it's a responsibility for me as a Taiwanese to defend my country, and Taiwan remains Taiwan.
It's shaping up as a fight for freedom, as China's military muscles up and its leader promises to take Taiwan by whatever means necessary.
Taiwan is with you!
But tonight, we meet the passionate Taiwanese.
We have to show this to China, to the world, that we want to defend our homeland.
Who are pleading with the Western world to stand up to an increasingly belligerent China.
I would call it a crime syndicate disguised as the nation.
Before it's too late.
I have to say, China is not only Taiwan's problem. China is your problem. China is the whole world's problem.
A quick history lesson might be helpful. Situated 160 kilometres off mainland China, Taiwan is home to an indigenous population that can be traced back 6,000 years. But it's been a major thorn in China's side since 1949. That's when Mao Zedong won China's civil war and the losing anti-communists fled to the tiny island. Democracy has thrived here, much to the rage of Beijing, which has long maintained Taiwan and its population of 23 million people belong to China. And under the leadership of Xi Jinping, the authoritarian superpower has become more aggressive than ever before about achieving unification, threatening a full-scale invasion.
Hi, Tom. Hello, Minister. Welcome to the ministry.
Thank you. It's great to see you.
Yeah, wonderful to see you too.
Joseph Wu has the unenviable role of Foreign Minister of Taiwan as his country stares down this threat to its very existence.
Got a lot on your plate at the moment. That's right. That's right. A lot of people are saying that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the toughest job in Taiwan and probably the toughest Ministry of Foreign Affairs position around the world. Indeed, it is very tough. Looking at China's way of suffocating Taiwan diplomatically, it is not easy.
Last month at the Communist Party Congress, Chinese President Xi Jinping scrapped constitutional rules so he could govern for a third term as party leader. His biggest foreign policy goal is to retake Taiwan by force if necessary.
The complete reunification of the motherland must be achieved.
Xi Jinping has been very clear that he thinks unification will happen. He says it's inevitable.
That's what he said. But I think there's something is not there in his thinking. Taiwan is already a democracy, and there's no way you can pressure the Taiwanese people to accept something that China is offering, and therefore the Taiwanese people reject what China is trying to put on Taiwan.
Do you think China is trying to strangle Taiwan?
Yes, they are trying from all perspectives. Military is certainly one. And they're also trying to suffocate Taiwan diplomatically, and they're also trying to strangle Taiwan economically. They want to hurt Taiwan. The effect is right opposite. The Taiwanese are more toughened than before in defending ourselves.
Raise your hands in the air! Say hi to the world!
The growling lead singer of Taiwanese death metal band Katoni, Freddie Lim, speaks to the country's younger generation. But in recent years, he's found a voice as one of Taiwan's most recognisable politicians.
You used to be on a tour bus, now it's a campaign trail. Pretty different for you these days.
It's a bit like on tour because you speak to different crowds with kind of the same thing.
So there's a bit of crossover of skills. You're still on stage and getting the crowd going?
Right. Yeah, and try to express the same energy to different crowds and with the same set.
It's a good turnout.
Yeah, I think even it's raining, but I think, yeah, we can see a lot of people.
Obviously, these people care a lot about voting, about democracy.
Yeah. So, well, I think she's trying to introduce
Oh,
me
you're
right
getting
now.
called up.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
don't let us hold you up.
Timing, as they say, is everything. And Freddie has become a frontman for Taiwan's independence movement at what he views as a critical point in history.
This is the moment that we show our passion about this country, show our will about defending our homeland. Not just to let the Chinese government know, but let our friends know that we will fight to the last minute to defend our home.
You're the frontman of a band, but also a frontman for democracy. What does China think about you?
They hate me, definitely. Their official medias and televisions has criticized me quite a lot. Even before I was a politician, my band was banned in China.
Hey, say cheese.
So I think they hate me and they want to remove me. But I will stand firm, yeah.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine set off alarm bells in Taiwan, a warning of just how quickly and dramatically things can change. Since then, the civil defence movement has exploded in popularity. Everyday Taiwanese taking up not just firearms training, but gaining a whole new set of skills, from search and recovery to learning to tie a tourniquet.
Wow, there's a lot of people here tonight.
Yeah. Thursday night, packed house. I think, for us, it just reinforces how average Taiwanese is committed to, defending our home, to helping each other, helping their communities.
Enoch Wu is a former Special Forces soldier who founded Forward Alliance, a group that better prepares Taiwanese for the disasters of tomorrow. His workshops have never been more in demand than they are right now.
You have to understand, our military and our first responders account for just 1% of our population. So we understand that if we ever face a major crisis, the other 99% have to step up. And it starts with staying alive, it starts with staying safe, it starts with helping your neighbor, and that's what we're doing.
Is the feeling here that the threat across the border has never been more apparent than right now?
Yeah, it's what we see from the Beijing authorities. It's also what we see in Ukraine, right? It's what we saw in Hong Kong. It's what we see around the world. When you're living next to an authoritarian regime, the best thing we can do is to be better prepared.
After the Russian invasion of Ukraine this year, there are plenty of young people joining those civil defense groups. And because we just realized that the responsibility to protect the country is not military's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. And so I can see that there are a lot of young people got inspired by Ukraine. So I'm quite optimistic about the future of this country because how the young people show their attitude.
If it came to it, would you pick up a weapon?
Definitely, because I'm older than 45. I'm not in an age that can be recruited by the military anymore. So I joined the civil defense to learn what I can do.
When you took up politics, you probably never thought that in a few years' time you'd be learning how to pick up a weapon.
Right. I didn't know that. I didn't know that those authoritarian governments can be that crazy. But this year, look at what Putin is doing. Yeah, I think they are crazier than we thought. So we have to be realistic. Yeah.
And ready.
Yeah, and ready. Prepare ourselves.
When it comes to the defence of Taiwan, few are quite as ambitious as Robert Zhao, the multi-billionaire who's ploughing his fortune into building a civilian army.
People say it's a lot of money. No, compared to freedom, it's nothing.
Recently, China has been stepping up its intimidation tactics, carrying out war games around Taiwan and testing its airspace like never before. In August this year alone, a record number of 446 Chinese aircraft, mainly fighter jets, breached Taiwan's air defence zone. So whenever there's an air incursion by China, this is where Taiwan's scrambling fighter jets from?
Yeah. Exactly. So this spot is very, very important.
Guarding Taiwan's mountainous east coast is the city of Hualien. It's home to 100,000 people and a cluster of key military installations, a place where the roar of F-16 fighter jets is part of everyday life.
In my understanding, we can park more than 200 fighter jets here in this neighborhood.
So this is quite a strategically important location.
Oh, very, because we are standing right next to the Pacific Ocean, and this is one of the biggest military bases in Taiwan.
Five months ago, Kolis Yatako was a spokesperson for the Taiwanese president. Now she's running for governor of Hualien, motivated by a deep concern about China's growing aggression.
China has been threatening, showing their muscles, and they have been warning Taiwanese, don't do anything crazy. They want to scare us. They want to block us. That's why they send fighter jets and warships here.
If this descended to war, would you expect that your allies would come to Taiwan's aid?
We can never speak for them. Yeah, we cannot speak for other countries.
Sounds like a fighter jet taking off above us right now.
Yeah, exactly. You hear this every day, all the time. People see the fighter jets taking off every day. And we hear that even when you are buying bubble tea at the street, you can see fighter jets flying over. It affects your work, it affects your life. But we have to live with it. That's how people feel.
The pride of this country is on display at Taiwan's National Day celebrations, along with plenty of defiance. The Taiwanese president declaring there will be no compromise on freedom and democracy. As the threat level rises, more than ever, this is a country that needs friends standing shoulder to shoulder.
If we were to lose Taiwan, I think all across the Indo-Pacific, the gates would be open to China, and we can't even begin to calculate the consequences.
It sounds like this is the great existential threat of our age.
That's exactly what it is.
Former US National Security Advisor John Bolton is a seasoned veteran of world diplomacy, a hawk who believes it's time for the US and its allies to get much tougher with Beijing. Do you think we need boots on the ground in Taiwan? Perhaps some US forces stationed there to send a message that the world has Taiwan's back?
I think a U.S. presence would be a good idea. And the ideal outcome here is that China says this is too hard for us to do and they back away.
But if China decides it is up for the fight, from the West's point of view, is this really worth World War III?
I don't think China wants to take over an island that's a heap of smoking rubble. I think if we do this right, Xi Jinping can be deterred, and he must know that if he makes a play for Taiwan and fails, that is regime threatening for him. So we just have to be more sophisticated than we've been here. We also have to realize we're in for a long-term struggle. This is not a short-term proposition.
If there's one person who's readying Taiwan for the long haul, it's billionaire businessman Robert Zhao. What's the thinking behind the vest?
Yeah, it's just provide a protection against the terrorists.
Why do you think you're a target?
I criticize China very strongly.
At an age when most people would be winding down, the 75-year-old is gearing up for the battle of his life. What does this place mean to you?
Freedom, democracy, hope, future. This is a place I want to protect.
The microchip magnate caused a sensation in September when he pledged $100 million to bolster his country's defences. His ultimate aim is to train a 3 million strong civilian army, complete with 300,000 snipers and supported by 1 million military drones.
The real defense has to be the bravery of the Taiwanese people, the willingness to protect your nation. Yeah, that's the real defense.
Yeah, $100 million is a hell of a lot of money. You're really putting your money where your mouth is.
People say it's a lot of money. No, compared to freedom, it's nothing. But I already swear that I will not live to see Taiwan become Hong Kong. Yeah. I will fight for it.
There's another unexpected consequence for all of us if war does break out in Taiwan. This high-tech country manufactures more than 90% of the world's computer chips, as well as the components that are critical for everything from phones to cars to fighter jets. If Taiwan's microchip factories are destroyed or their supply chains disrupted, the ramifications globally would be dire. If you take Taiwan's microchip production away from the world, what happens?
A global economic catastrophe.
Jason Matheny is head of US think tank the Rand Corporation and an expert in threats to humanity. He's forecast a grim future if war begins in Taiwan. Virtually all of the world's advanced microchip industry is based there, a quirk of circumstance that now presents an acute risk to us all.
It would affect all of us. It would mean that we wouldn't have access to the devices that most of us depend on as part of our daily lives. It comes down to, around a dozen or so large factories that are in a relatively small strip of land, producing what's really the foundation of the digital economy today. It's really an extraordinary thing that the centerpiece of our economy is concentrated in such a small piece of the planet, and one of the most complicated ones geopolitically.
It's the Achilles heel of the world's economy.
That's right. I think if we had thought about this, decades ago, and thought, would we want the Achilles heel of the global economy to be in a place that China views as the fulfillment of its national destiny, I think we probably would have picked a different place.
Such is the complexity of microchip production that Jason believes it would genuinely take decades to build replica facilities in other parts of the world. It would also come at a completely untenable cost. So, in his mind, the only sensible path forward is to appropriately arm Taiwan right now to counter China's military threat.
It would be a fraction of the cost of dealing with the repercussions of some massive disruption of the supply chain. It would be a fraction of that cost to arm Taiwan to the level needed to prevent such a disruption.
There have been some claims that the United States would try to blow up these facilities themselves if China were to invade, so that they didn't fall into Chinese hands. Do you give that much credit?
I think whoever is president during that moment would have a really difficult dilemma, because on the one hand, you would be deciding whether or not you wanted these manufacturing facilities to be controlled by China, used as a choke point for the global supply chain that would give China enormous leverage geopolitically. On the other hand, if we destroyed those manufacturing facilities, we would be responsible for significant global economic damage. And so whatever choice is made in that situation is one that I wouldn't envy. And I think the ideal case is one where we prevent the invasion from happening at all.
In this battle for hearts and minds, Beijing has an unlikely ally pushing its agenda inside Taiwan.
So they call you the White Wolf. Some people call you a gangster.
Gangster?
Yeah?
I don't care.
In one part of Taiwan, locals stare down the threat from China every single day. We've come to Kinmen Island, a bizarre relic of a bygone time and a living museum to war. While the main island of Taiwan may be 160 kilometres away from Kinmen, the skyscrapers of the Chinese mainland loom less than 5 kilometres across the water. Here, they know more than anyone about the brutality of China, once the sworn enemy that rained hell from above.
Nationalist soldiers watch the Red China mainland from tiny Kinmen Island, on guard against further attacks from the enemy, whose bombs and guns have pounded villages into tipsy, tilted walls and piles of rubble.
In the 1950s, China's military launched a devastating artillery bombardment on Kinmen, firing 500,000 shells in a 6-week barrage in a continuation of the bloody civil war. In fact, so many shells remain that they are now being melted down and turned into knives for the tourists who come to visit this Cold War curiosity. The entire island is littered with old military sites, the beaches still bristling with defences, and below ground, an extraordinary network of military tunnels from the bad old days of conflict.
Up until the 70s, China was still regularly bombing this island, and this network of tunnels is where the locals would come to take shelter. Now, they thought that threat had passed, but all of a sudden, with tensions rising, the fear is they may need these tunnels again. China is so close.
Yeah, really so close. You can see the buildings over there.
Yeah, but it's a different world.
Yeah, really. It's 1 o'clock. Bob, you should write a sentence. It's 1 o'clock.
23-year-old Kevin Poe is a teacher in what is, for now, a quiet frontier with close economic links to the Chinese mainland.
Very good. It's 1 o'clock.
He's nervous about the future But hopeful Kinman won't face Chinese attack once again.
People here, they still remember the memories from the war, and we have many forts here. Yeah, if something happens, we can just run into the fort or the tunnels here.
Do you think they will take over one day?
Maybe.
How would you feel about that?
I think people in Taiwan, especially younger generation, we will fight just like what happened in Hong Kong.
So you would fight?
Yeah, if my country needs me, I will fight.
Is that a scary prospect?
Yeah, kind of scary, because in our generation, we only see the war on internet, in videos. We don't know how scary it is. Yeah, so we really don't want the war.
But not everyone in Taiwan is on board with fighting off communist rule. Around 7% of the population is in favour of unification with China. The irony being that they are free to voice that anti-government sentiment in democratic Taiwan, while such rebellion in China would be punished dearly.
What country are we in right now?
It's China. Taiwan is part of China, it's no question.
The majority of people here do not want to be part of China.
Yeah, because they're brainwashed.
Back in the capital, Taipei, we met Chang'an Lo, controversial frontman of the Chinese Unification Promotion Party.
So they call you the White Wolf.
Wolf can walk 1,000 miles, even though slow, but keep going. You know, leopard, tiger, you know, fast, boom, then stop. Some wolf, yes, I'm wolf.
Some people call you a gangster.
Gangster?
Yeah.
I don't care.
To call the White Wolf's past colourful would be an understatement. He was once one of Taiwan's most feared triad leaders, convicted kidnapper and heroin trafficker who spent jail time in the US. Now, he's a political campaigner who leads a fringe pro-unification party and is viewed by many here as Beijing's yes man in Taiwan.
I think the peaceful unification is the best way for Taiwanese future. No other way.
Because you think the only other alternative is unification by force?
Eventually, yes. Yeah. Because majority Chinese want to take Taiwan back. You know, the best way is peaceful. By force is tragedy for Taiwanese people.
China's foreign spruikers are renowned for veiled threats and intimidation, and they are traits Taiwan's White Wolf has in spades.
Many people in Taiwan have asked for Australia to defend Taiwan militarily. What would it mean for Australia if they did come to Taiwan's aid?
If you tell the truth to fight with mainland China, many Australian soldiers get killed. I don't think Australian people will so still be.
There are some political parties in Taiwan that are in favour of unification. Do you think they're just puppets of the Chinese government?
They are puppets. They are controlled by Chinese government.
Taiwan's rock star politician Freddie Lim says the agitation by people like the White Wolf is all part of Beijing's playbook.
So you think China plays dirty?
Yes, definitely.
In some ways, the war has already begun.
Yeah, it's not about the war of weapons anymore. They buy your politicians. They control your economy. They control your community. They control your religious groups. Yeah, and cyber attacks and information warfare.
When China decides to make good on its promise to take Taiwan is anyone's guess. But just last month, the head of the US Navy warned America needs to prepare for a possible invasion within the next year. It's a worrying prediction, and for passionate and patriotic locals like Kolis Yataka, it's now critical for the democratic world to stand up to the communist regime before this descends into all-out war.
Why do you think the average Australian should care about what's happening here at the moment?
Why? Because we don't want to feel alone. Because we share the same political idea and we do believe in democracy. Taiwanese people are just like you. We want to have the right to vote. We want to have our own government. We don't want to be part of China. Actually, we are never part of China at all. We are an independent country. We are just like you.
Will Taiwan ever be part of China?
No, never, never, impossible. Taiwan is never and was never part of China at all. Not at all.
Hello, I'm Tom Steinford. Thanks for watching 60 Minutes Australia. Subscribe to our channel now for brand new stories and exclusive clips every week. And don't miss out on our Extra Minutes segments and full episodes of 60 Minutes on 9now.com.au, as well as the 9Now app.
Japan announces its biggest military build-up since World War II. It wants to develop long-range missiles. But what will this mean for the Asia-Pacific region and Japan's pacifist constitution? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Japan says the strategic challenge posed by China is the biggest it's ever faced. Besides Beijing, Japan has two other nuclear-armed neighbours in North Korea and Russia. It's expressed concerns about intensifying Russian military activity in its Far East, even as Moscow presses on with its war against Ukraine. And a North Korean missile flew over Japan in October. But Tokyo's military expansion plans are a reminder of an imperial past when it occupied the Korean peninsula and parts of China and seized all of East Asia during the Second World War. We'll get to our guests in just a moment. First, this report from Ferdy Akar.
For decades, Japan's post-war military policy has been defined by its pacifist constitution. America's fight against Japan in the Second World War killed millions and left the country in ruins. The US forced it to accept restrictions to its military, so it could never again threaten peace in the region. But 8 decades on, the West now counts on Japan as a crucial ally against a rising China and a nuclear-armed North Korea. Now, Japan wants to significantly increase its military spending, $315 billion in the next 5 years, or 2% of its GDP. The money's meant to rapidly expand its military, including acquiring long-range missiles. Japan's governing right-wing Liberal Democratic Party has pushed for more military spending in recent years.
As we look back on the past year, for the first time in 5 years, a ballistic missile flew over our airspace. Another landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone. We've also seen signs of preparation towards nuclear testing. The boundaries between confrontations and peacetime, military and non-military, are no longer clear.
And a historically pacifist public appears to have shifted too. Russia's attack on Ukraine has raised alarm in Tokyo about territorial disputes with Moscow. China's claims in the South China Sea too are seen as an increasing threat. Add to that list Beijing's military drills around Taiwan earlier this year, in which some of the Chinese missiles landed in waters close to Japanese islands, and China's push for reunification with Taiwan. Japan fears this could choke off its shipping lanes used for energy imports. But China insists Japan must pursue diplomacy.
Japan's proposed defense policy document, in disregard of facts, deviates from Japan's commitment to bilateral relations and the consensus between China and Japan, and contains groundless smears against China. China is firmly opposed to this. We have been making clear our solemn position with the Japanese side through diplomatic channels.
For decades, Japan's security was enhanced by the presence of US bases. But concerned about doing the heavy lifting for its allies, Washington has given its support for Japan's planned military expansion. With North Korea flying missiles over Japan, Tokyo wants to get South Korea on side too. The two countries have pledged to mend historically poor relations. The Korean peninsula was the victim of Japan's militaristic expansionism a century ago, and the subject of changing its pacifist constitution has caused concern. But leaders in Tokyo insist the imperial era has long since passed, and Japan must now look to rearm. Freddie Akar for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. And in Singapore, Kotaro Tamura, adjunct professor at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He's also a former senator with Japan's Liberal Democratic Party. In Tokyo, Nancy Snow, communications director at the International Security Industrial Council. She's also a foreign policy advisor to the Japanese government. And in Taipei, David Arasi, resident professor of international politics at the Hopkins Nanjing Center. A very warm welcome to all of you. Kotaro, let's start because this is a significant break, isn't it, of Japan's long-held tradition of only having defensive weapons. Is this Japan abandoning its pacifist stance?
Well, Japan is a peace lover since the last war. And the peace is nothing but balance. Japan think balance is pretty much out of balance. Broken in favor of, I think, China. And we are surrounded by very powerful neighbors like Russia, North Korea, China. Since the war happens in Ukraine, I think we are in the most challenging situation since the last war. So we need to push back to the new equilibrium. And Japan is just doing that to get back balance in East Asia. So I think several countries might follow Japan's path, including Taiwan. I'm not pretty sure about what will happen in Korea, but I will tell you later my own view.
We will look a little bit more at the wider region in a moment. David, first of all, do you agree with Kotaro's view that this is Japan balancing the situation rather than making an aggressive stance?
Well, it hasn't made a move at all toward amending its peace constitution with Article 9. What's happened is the war in Ukraine, I think, has changed the consciousness and the debate about security in Asia, because, as in Europe, an actual shooting war was unthinkable, and it has been unthinkable in Asia. But the Ukraine war has proven that war is, in fact, a real possibility, particularly because Japan's neighbors, North Korea, Russia, which has labeled Japan an unfriendly country because it leveled sanctions against Russia after Ukraine, and China, they all have their fingers on the trigger. And so Japan has held to a 1% of GDP spending limit since basically the end of World War II. And it's now woken up to the fact that it's actually in a very perilous situation. A war could break out either in the Korean Peninsula, in East China Sea, Taiwan or South China Sea, and any contingencies in any of those areas would be an existential threat for Japan's economy. So Japan is reacting now by increasing its spending above 1% to the NATO 2% norm within 5 years.
Nancy, Japan may not have changed its constitution, but does not the acquisition of Tomahawk missiles, which can hit China, which can hit Russia, is that not direct confrontational conflict with the Article 9, the pacifist part of the Constitution?
Well, I was just watching a briefing by the Japanese government because they released the new national security doctrine today. And they made it very clear that even with this increase in the military, the emphasis was on deterrence and it was on defense. So it was not on becoming an aggressor power. If anything, Japan is taking a role of a stability partner in the world. We see this through the Quad. We see this through the rhetoric of free and open Indo-Pacific. So Japan is not really hungry for going to war. It is wishing to protect itself, defend itself against these existential threats that have been mentioned. The curious part here is how you're going to pay for it. That's the other angle to this. And there is some debate and dissent inside of the LDP, including top ministers, about going with the corporate tax or increasing deficit spending. But the public is largely on board. It's ironic when you think back to Shinzo Abe in 2016, people were taking to the street about changing the Constitution and becoming more of an assertive player on the world stage. Now it's about 51% support for this increase in defense spending. And mind you, this is going to be over 5 years, so this is not going to happen overnight. But it's a response to the realities of living not only in a dangerous neighborhood, but in an increasingly dangerous world. We can all see that.
Kotaro, do you think the public is going to remain on board when it looks like the funding for this increased defense spending is going to come from their pockets? It's going to come from raising taxes.
I think general public opinion dramatically changed since the Ukraine war. It's a very, interesting wake-up call for Japanese public. Of course, there's still the debate on how to compensate for this large, expenditure using tax cut, or the spending cut. And basically, government is announcing they will use the three kind of tax: corporate tax, income tax, and the tobacco tax. But they are not clearly mentioning. And so 2% increase to the GDP, 2% of the GDP is not happening. As someone said right away, it takes 5 years until 2027. But Japanese people is gradually and steadily understanding we are not living in the end of the history. So history is here, and still rule of jungle is prevailing in East Asia as well. So our neighbors is much more powerful, and the conflict of the consequences of the conflict will be much larger, because if something happens on Taiwan, number one, number two, number three economy will be involved. So we need to push back to the equilibrium, in order to not such kind of a tragedy happens, to save the economy, to save the peace and stability of the region.
David, what's been Beijing's response to this? I mean, they were pretty unhappy to be singled out as an unprecedented strategic challenge, weren't they?
Yes, but at the same time, I think China knew very well what was going to happen weeks, maybe months ago. So what they've done is they've played down this change, and they're actually emphasizing cooperative relations with Japan. They've made it very clear that they want cooperative relations, especially in the economic sphere, which meshes very well with the Japanese hedging strategy. Because even though Japan is increasing its deterrence and defense capabilities, at the same time Japan has been very careful all along to tell China that it's interested in maintaining a very productive and mutually beneficial economic relationship. It's not interested in fighting a war or starting a war or doing anything risky, but it's just basically putting China on guard, on warning that Japan will defend its territory, its sovereignty, its national interests in extreme cases.
I mean, a big question, David, I suppose, is whether China invades Taiwan. Then Japan really does have to get involved, doesn't it?
Yeah, one of two ways. One is if it absolutely does not do anything to to Japan and Japanese claimed territories and just focuses only on Taiwan. But even that is a huge security problem for Japan and also for the United States and for Taiwan, obviously. And so Japan is likely, in either case, whether it's attacked, whether its territories are attacked as part of a large operation against Taiwan, or even if it's excluded, there's a good chance that Japan will be forced into it, because I don't really think that if the U.S. gets into this, gets involved, that U.S. bases in Okinawa and other places would be immune to a Chinese strike, which of course is a strike on Japanese territory. So basically, whatever happens with Taiwan is going to deeply affect Japan. And actually, it won't just stop there. It'll affect South Korea, it'll affect Southeast Asia, the economies and security of those countries as well. And so, but yeah, I think Japan actually has calculated that the situation in the Taiwan Strait has gotten to the point where they really have to be attentive and be prepared for contingencies.
And Nancy, how much does this shift from Japan deter China from invading Taiwan?
I don't really know about China invading Taiwan anytime soon. And this is so much broader than just war games. We talk so much about Taiwan, but Japan has other challenges in terms of increasing its defense budget. It's very weak in cybersecurity defense vis-a-vis China. China's much more further along. So when we talk about war, we're changing the dynamic, the understanding of war now. It involves information, it involves diplomacy, it involves economics. And this is why it's critical that there is a conversation more nationally within Japan and within Asia about where are we going, because really this is increasingly a competition from an authoritarian regime to those that are more open societies. So this is a conversation about what kind of world order do we want, rule of law. And this is the talk coming out of Japan and the other Quad members. And this is why alliances are so important. But Taiwan, we talk about we talk about it so much, but it's just so much bigger than that. And of course, that is a concern. But this is about human security. It's about civil society. And that's why having the communications angle, which is the field I work in, is critical, because the public will go up and down on this issue. If there's a missile strike coming from North Korea, of course, then people want to respond to it. But if it's just a pocketbook issue and it looks like people are suffering because of it, then their support will wane. So they have to be on board, and they have to have a better understanding of this.
And also, Kotaro, if we're looking at other areas that Japan is going to be funding, it's spending $14 billion on space capabilities. I mean, that actually sounds quite exciting. What does that involve?
So Japan will be spending the additional part, not only for updating Japan's capability, counterattack capability, including a cruise missile, but also cybersecurity and the space, and updating the all the facilities. And self-defense force itself is aging, so we need to recruit young, fresh people. And as someone has mentioned, it's important not only increasing the military spending, but also increase the opportunity to dialogue between China and Japan. And miscalculation and miscommunication is very dangerous. So in addition to the channels for regular dialogue, but also we have to have a top to bottom channel and also hotline in the case of emergency happening. So that's the most important part, I think.
Okay. David, what fears are there, if any, that this build-up of missile capability, of which we've seen a lot of in the region recently, is going to spark further an arms race throughout the Asia-Pacific?
I guess you're talking about Japan's acquisition of 1,000
on top
sort of longer range
North
missiles.
Korea building up its missile capability and others, yes.
Yes. Yes. Well, so it's important to understand what these missiles are intended for and what they're capable of. So these are going to be at least at first mostly cruise missiles, and they're going to be able to strike for the first time. Japan's going to be able to strike land targets in North Korea and in China, and this is a big change because in terms of weapons procurement and doctrine, Japanese have not thought about defense going as far as striking enemy military capabilities. But because of the incredible speed of modern war, particularly with the stock of missiles that Korea and China have, Japan really can't mount a credible defense or can't mount a credible deterrence if it just waits to be hit after lengthy preparation with massive waves of ballistic missiles. It has to be able to strike the bases that are sending the missiles to Japan in order to defend itself. And so that's why these missiles are designated as counter-strike missiles. And it's not meant to it's not meant to add to an arms race. It's meant to correct for just an accumulating advantage for a first strike by North Korea or China. And it's gotten to the point now where there's so many offensive missiles able to target Japan or Taiwan or any close-in targets that just a first strike could be absolutely crippling and disabling and leaving the victim or target unable to defend itself. Particularly if it had no way to take out the launch sites.
Okay.
So
Kotaro, I
that's
just
what
want to
these
jump in
missiles
there
are.
because I want to get an idea from you that, Japan, if it has these Tomahawk cruise missiles, if it has them, surely it's got to be prepared to use them. But is it going to do that?
So, our neighboring powerful country is too close and the missile is supersonic right now. So, we declared, counter-attack capability preparation. That means, preemptive attack. So first strike will be very, very crucial. And for example, China had tons of supersonic missiles on the coastline. So that's so close. That's less than 5 minutes arriving in the territory of Japan. So I think the Aegis, like shielding, preparing for the shield for the missiles, I don't think it's enough. And one thing happened, so it's too late, and we need to at least prepare. We need to have to show we have a capability. If you do something wrong, we are ready to do something also not very usual to use. This is very important, I think, for the equivalent taking balance.
Nancy, does Japan feel that it may have to do this because it's looking to the US and seeing that perhaps it's not quite as reliable a partner as it might have once thought?
Of course, yeah. I mean, the U.S.-Japan relationship now is very solid, but all you have to do is look at the United States and you see a lot of polarization. You see a country that needs this alliance help. It can't be the only Pacific power engaging in all of these various threats. I was trying to jump in earlier, though, to say we've got to look forward here to the G7 meeting that's taking place in May 2023 in Hiroshima, Japan. You couldn't get more symbolic. So talking about increasing the defense budget at the same time that there will be talk about ridding a world of nuclear weapons. I mean, you know, we're sort of dreaming big. At the same time, we're talking about first strike, counterstrike capacity. And we don't want to raise so many fears that people will be paralyzed by fear that something is inevitably going to happen. And so that's why I stress dialogue, discourse, that you keep these the information clear to the public, and also meet regularly. I mean, Japan and China are major trade partners with each other. They're fully integrated. And so it's not just about threats always. It's also about daily business activities. And that's why, again, I say, look at the larger picture here.
Well, that's a very interesting point to finish on. Thank you very much to all our guests for joining us today. Kotaro Tamura, Nancy Snow and David Arase. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.
Okay, hi everyone. 大家好. Really thrilled you could make it this afternoon. Realize it's such gorgeous weather out there. It's hard to come inside. Maybe we should have done this outside. Luncheon was admiring that we had a seminar going outside in the Watson Center, of course, on such a beautiful day. It makes sense. But anyway, here we are, and really glad that you all are here. This is one of a series of lectures by the China Initiative. The China Initiative, very busy in this season. If you haven't noticed, there's another major China talk this Thursday, Victor Schur, coming from San Diego. And then next week, also a couple of talks. Zach Cooper will speak on the sensitive Taiwan issue. And in this series, we'll have Elizabeth Wishnick. But this is what we're trying to do with this talk is we call this the Project on China's Key Bilateral Relationships. And what we're doing is each semester taking a critical piece of Chinese foreign policy and looking narrowly at that. So this is the first of 3 talks that we're going to have on that so critical China-Russia relationship. So we're so pleased here. I don't think we could have a better expert on this subject this afternoon than Professor Lan Xinxiang, who came down from Cambridge, where he's serving as a visiting fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard. But let me, if I can describe his background a little, I think you'll understand why he really is the perfect person to address us on this topic. He is director of the Institute of Security Policy at the China National Institute for SCO, International Exchanges and Judicial Cooperation. He was born in Nanjing, and he's a graduate of Fudan University in Shanghai. If some of you know that very prestigious Chinese university, I've had the pleasure to visit many times. I'm very excited to learn, I didn't know this, but he's a graduate of Johns Hopkins SAIS. I am too. So we both have our masters from Johns Hopkins. He went on and has a PhD from SAIS as well. But for many, many years, he served as a professor at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And there, I believe, he wrote the book, The Quest for Legitimacy in Chinese Politics. So in addition to being a visiting fellow now at the Belfer Center, he's also senior fellow at the Stimson Center. And I just found out that he held the very prestigious Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, which is a very, very interesting place also to observe U.S.-China relations. So we're thrilled to have him as our first speaker in this series, and very anxious to tap his expertise on Europe-China interactions here by asking him some questions about China-Russia relations. I do want to say before we get started, though, although we will be, of course, we're trying to really probe the China-Russia relationship, which is absolutely critical, but Professor Xiang has graciously agreed also to share insights on other issues that might interest you on China as well. Indeed, I think earlier today he gave a lecture on the 20th Party Congress, so he will take questions across the gamut, but let's have some good questions on China-Russia relations as well. But please join me in thanking Professor Xiang for visiting us today.
Thank you, Lyle, and thank you for OSINT Institute for inviting me. As Lyle just mentioned, that I have been making rounds lately on Party Congress from Washington, New York, Boston. This is a great change for me. It's a much more interesting topic. That's because I'm a bit tired of explaining Party Congress, which is wildly misunderstood in any case. But we can debate about that. Here, I simply want to stick to the topic here. The topic is Russia and China unlikely brotherhood. That's the title I chose for a very simple reason. That the China-Russian relationship developed this way. I don't believe any historians or even political scientists or international relations experts had expected, let's say, even 10 years ago. It's extremely hard to imagine. When I went to Russia to give speeches, by the way, I'm part of this Putin thing called the Valdai Club, so I go to Russia quite often, give speeches. I usually start with a joke only Russians understood. I will say U.S.-China, the Russian-China relationship is the best at the peak today. Then I stop 2 seconds and say, since Catherine the Great. Now, Russians got my joke. That's to say, these two nations, two countries, they had nothing in common. They hate each other for centuries. They cannot compromise very much on their, not just national interest, but the temperament and almost everything. Somehow they are become the best partner. Okay. By the way, I totally agree with Lyle. In the West, people tend to talk about alliance. That's a total misnomer. There is no alliance. I don't believe there is any chance they become alliance in the military, sense. But they has somehow become the best partner bilaterally for reasons I think I believe not quite explained very well. Okay, I want to mention a couple of things which is familiar things, but I also want to mention a couple of things which is not quite familiar or not much discussed. Why we have reached this level. Okay. Now, historically, oh, maybe I get my water. Sorry. Sorry. All right. First of all, historically, China always had a different view about the Russians or Russian people. You may have heard the Chinese, since the old dynasty period, they call every foreigner, the Europeans, barbarians. But the Russians actually did not even enjoy that title. We know Russians even before we know the British or all the others coming to China after the Opium War. Okay. We had a diplomatic treaty even with Russians, which is very few people remember these days. Okay. We'll talk about, of course, the Treaty of Nishinsky, 1689. That's way before the British tried to impose a Western system on China. Chinese have a different name for Russians for many, many, many centuries. translation is difficult. I think Chinese understand. It's called Old Hairy Man. That's Lao Mao's for Chinese language speaker, you'd understand what I'm saying. It's a unique name for the Russians. For several, it's not a nice title for the Russians. They are more than being barbarian, in other words. They are dangerous, they are threatening, because we share borders, okay, for many centuries, especially after Tsarist expansion into the east. China and the Russia or Chinese dynasty had so many fights with the Russians. The Treaty Nashinsky, by the way, is the treaty actually settled the border dispute to begin with, okay? Even though it's not under Westphalian logic at the time. It's a realpolitik logic. Okay. So to put my story short, I don't want to go all the way since 16-something. I simply want to emphasize throughout history, the two countries have very little real affection of each other. And under communism, we actually had a war, right? We're supposed to be communist ally during the 50s and 60s. That's the only war, serious war, aside from the Korean War, is different. But we had with Russia, it's over the border dispute. Okay. How many border disputes we have? Very few people in the West know, or they don't even care. Okay. Here I want to emphasize why China and the Russian relationship improved so much in the last 20 or so years. This is a very important factor you should keep in mind. That's under Putin, there is a long dragging process of secret diplomacy between China and Russia over the historical dispute on territories. How many of them? I used to think 7,000, my data shows it's a 7,700, big or small. You think about the long border, everything, over river, over land. But at one meeting, I was at Sochi in the same room with Putin. Putin actually corrected my data. He said 8,000, he said. That's shocking. But, you know, in the West, nobody comments on that. Of course, I'm not. Let me quote what Putin's, complained, of course. Nobody give us Nobel Peace Prize, right? How many left? How many disputes settled? How many left today? 7.5. Okay. Now, that is a great achievement for a bilateral territorial dispute, no matter how you look at it. It is a major contribution to peace for the two powers who could end up many possibilities for them to go to war. Territorial dispute, we all know. Even small one could, trigger some major conflict. So this is one foundation I think has been neglected when they talk about why China and Russia are coming close together. American factor, which I will discuss, of course, is not the only thing. Okay? Yes, American factor or US factor is very, very crucial as well, pushing these two together. That, of course, is for very, very pragmatic geopolitical reasons. For some reason, after Cold War, United States, at least from my perspective, or from China perspective, seem to have made a decision to somehow squeeze as much as they can the living space of Russia, at least from a Russian point of view. The NATO enlargement, when the 1998, I believe, at that point, that decision was made, China also panicked, at least for 6 or 8 months. I remember at that time I was invited by one of the advisors who served as Jiang Zemin's advisor to write something. I believe I wrote something. They said we want to know how NATO enlargement will affecting China. Are they going to move all the way to the East Asian, and what is the trend for the West, for NATO? So at that moment, NATO enlargement already alerted Chinese enormously. Okay. But of course, from the Western point of view, NATO enlargement has nothing to do with the current war in Ukraine. That I think no one in China, I'm talking about not just leaders, but also scholars or elite policymakers, nobody believes that is the case. At least you have to look at history seriously. You have to look at what George Kennan said, which at that time predicted what the Russian behavior might become. So I really have difficulty to understand why that episode of history is being somehow written off. Now, this is another reason Chinese look at the NATO behavior. They certainly begin to worry about the Taiwan side of the story, or the East Asian side, the Pacific side. So what Chinese policymakers now call salami slicing strategy. In Europe, squeeze Russian space. In Asia, squeeze Chinese space. So this logic also helped pushing them together for very, in my view, it's a geostrategic reasons. It's not even, there is no ideology there. Yeah, no ideology there. So this is the U.S. factor. Now, but the other point I want to emphasize for the U.S. government in recent years is they decide to alienate or make both China and Russia the chief enemy or target. China actually now elevate to be number one at the same time. Now, this is a logic, again, I think it's very difficult for me or for many Chinese policymakers to understand. As Henry Kissinger said many, many times, even during the Cold War, you don't do that. You try to drive some kind of a wedge, right, between Moscow and the Beijing, and it usually worked. The great strategic triangle in the 70s worked wonders, actually. But somehow Americans, U.S. in particular, U.S. government in particular, last two governments seem to decide that they can afford to abandon that strategy. So pitting the U.S., or they try to use what they call democratic alliance to create two bloc politics, basically. That, of course, from a Chinese point of view, China actually had very little room to maneuver. For the war in Ukraine, we can discuss more on the war if you want to, but China hesitated really at the beginning to really support Russia. China, it's unthinkable China will support a new type of a Brezhnev doctrine, which China hated most, is you invading another brotherly country just by, tanks. The Czechoslovakia event in 1968 is the direct trigger of our border war between China and the Soviet Union. It's not because of terrorism, but that's triggered by the Czech invasion at the time. China tried to fight back the Brezhnev doctrine. Somehow they have no maneuvering room. In the end, they have to acquiesce what the Russians have been doing. Okay. It's unfortunate. China put itself in the unfortunate situation, but I do not see there is any chance that situation will change because simply they don't have sufficient room to play. The other side of the story I want to emphasize again is American under Biden administration, actually. escalate quite quickly, quite steadily of supporting not Taiwan independence, that's exaggeration, it's kind of de facto one China, one Taiwan policy. They are not pursuing two China. They are not pursuing really what they call the one China policy. They are choosing some kind of strategy in between, one China and two China. From Chinese point of view, that's something they will never be able to accept. This is a war-provoking strategy and seem to be escalating steadily, especially since Nancy Pelosi's visit. So all these things, when you put together, you look at the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. Of course, they have to push together. They have to become more and more collaborative on many, many issues. Okay. I want to emphasize another part of the story here. It's the Russian. China is also watching Russian behavior, the recent actions very, very closely. Battleground is total disappointment, like everybody else. How come the world number 2 military become maybe number 10? I don't know. Chinese military also totally surprised by it. I organized Track 2 in the summer. I have PRA generals, I have NATO generals, not American NATO generals, just talking about the battleground situation. Chinese side, Chinese generals are totally frustrated, saying how bad the Russian military. We used to know Russian military better than Western, military authorities, because we had a collaborative relationship between the Russian military and the Chinese. But we used to think the Russians are doing. So battleground is a bad news, but the Russian capability of dealing with the unprecedented sanctions, the measures they took, the Chinese are learning very, very carefully, especially the financial policy, central bank. The lady, she is the famous central banker. I think she maybe is one of the best in the world. No matter what you say, morally, her strategy seemed to have worked wonders of defending ruble. Of course, Chinese, we have more cards to play. Supposedly we attack Taiwan, you start the sanctions because of economic power and also economic relations with the West. But still, China are learning a lot from the, that is another factor. They are watching each other very, very closely. Now, the most recent development, unfortunately, is that could create some cracks between the two is the Putin's reckless talk about nuclear weapons. This is something I think is becoming increasingly difficult for Chinese government to endorse, even in the vague sense. The Chinese have to make some stand on that issue. And Putin understands that. He understands that. Because this is, of course, the nuclear doctrine question. I don't want to elaborate too much, but you know the superpower, the two former superpowers, U.S. and the Soviet Union, they never give up so-called first use doctrine of the nuclear weapons. They never say we renounce first use. China always say we never going to use first unless you use against me, right? So it's called a no first use doctrine. But with this Putin's behavior, we are entering a new era, even if he did not use it in the end, or whether or not Chinese will change that doctrine from so-called proportional deterrence, what de Gaulle used to call proportional deterrence. Proportional meaning we're only focusing on one or two major cities. Chinese military doctrine against U.S. for strategic weapons, you know, we used to say Los Angeles, Los Angeles, and Los Angeles. We only take out Los Angeles, so you cannot. That's the tolerance level we think Americans cannot tolerate. Therefore, there is a deterrence value, right? That's for second strike, of course. But now the issue is: are we going to abandon no first use altogether? That will transform the entire military doctrine and even force posture for the People's Liberation Army. So it's not something that the Chinese are facing enormous challenge on that. So this is, I think, it's, the result of this war in Ukraine. Now, will China support Russia militarily? I personally do not see it. Russians really need now are the drones. Chinese drones actually is better than Iranians. It's more accurate. I don't believe Xi Jinping would be willing to sign off a massive shipment of the Chinese AI. Here I want to emphasize the high-tech side because the Chinese AI seem to be moving extremely, quickly. Pentagon even said maybe in certain area of military usage, the Chinese already surpass that of the United States. Yes, we can, if we want to, supply even more effective drones to take out HIMARS, all the other stuff, but China will never do that. I don't believe they will risk that. It's not just alienate the United States. I personally, I believe Xi Jinping gave up on Biden already. If you want to know why, I can explain more. Because the Jakarta G20 is coming. Used to be Chinese are far more anxious for summits, because this would be the first physical summit between Xi Jinping and now it's the Biden side saying, let's work out agenda. Chinese seem to say, what's for? Because of the Taiwan issue, because of the escalation of the Taiwan issue. So here I want to say is that the relationship between Moscow and Beijing in the foreseeable future, generally speaking, I will not see any serious cracks coming. If there is cracks coming, there would be no public statement seriously in any way on China's side to criticize Putin, as long as there is no progress on Taiwan negotiations between U.S. and China. These two things are so closely linked now. Here you can see the 20th Party Congress now, the new Politburo makeup. I think Washington Post or some American press exaggerate a little bit. They say basically new Politburo is a war cabinet. Missiles, Taiwan, and espionage. That's the three keywords American press commenting on Chinese new leadership. It's not accurate. But I cannot deny the fact that this is a national security cabinet, almost like a war cabinet or semi-war cabinet, but also they are probably at the stage of expediting the preparation for a potential military conflict over the Taiwan issue. Okay. So at this next couple of years, now remember the Americans have all these deadlines. The Pacific Command, I think Davison, General Davison says 2027 is the deadline Chinese going to attack Taiwan. But I just heard Admiral Gilday in Washington lately. He said, no, Davison probably is more optimistic. 23, 24 is more like, wow. I said, what's the evidence? Where is the evidence? But it is not impossible, though. But I doubt it's going to be planned that way. It could well be, under the circumstances, accidental event, then trigger, then escalate. Yeah. there is no mechanism between U.S. and China, unlike during the Cold War between U.S. and the Soviet Union. There is no escalation management system exists today. The communication is also pretty much cut off between U.S. and China. Now, I mentioned this is, of course, a part of my discussion of the U.S. factor. Chinese ambassador in Washington only a few days ago was become news, but I knew that for quite a few. Who was here for a year and a half? The new ambassador who was completely cut off from access, even talking to senior officials. It never happened during the Cold War. Kissinger kept a tunnel open for Dobrynin, Russian ambassador. If there is something want to talk, you don't have to be noticed by the press, right? You go straight to see. Somehow Biden team decided not even allow any serious access. So that is frustrating from a Chinese point of view. They don't talk seriously anymore. When they do talk, they talk consistently past each other. Think about Anchorage, starting with Anchorage, right? Alaska, the first supposedly important conversation, turned out to be a shouting match in the end. And there are several other bilateral talks that yield nothing. I think one problem that Chinese are frustrated when dealing with United States, which is the question of the Biden administration's key concept, that is the democracy versus autocracy is at the core of American national security strategy. Now, when you do great power politics based on ideological issues, I'm not saying ideological issues not important. Human rights, all these issues are important. I also wrote quite a few things in English, of course, mostly criticizing the Chinese policies on a variety of issues. But you cannot bet the geopolitical, issues or your national security issues pinned on the ideological questions. The conversation China and the U.S. are having now, in most cases, are the U.S. side, making accusations 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically like that. There's nothing practical they're talking about. Now, with Russia, of course, it's a totally different picture. They are, there's not much ideological thing going on. You see, I think I want to conclude by saying there's one misunderstanding in the U.S., in particular, about this relationship is that they believe Russia and China represent a model that challenge the Western order or Western democracy. That is something I think I cannot believe it's true, okay? Because communist system lost attraction for everywhere in the world. You think Chinese is still communist? Of course, that you don't know China, right? So nothing I can say. I wrote a book about legitimacy question of China, how to define. Yes, it is still one-party dictatorship. It is still, but how big difference from today's system and the old dynastic system in terms of the policy making and so on. I would say much closer to that than to a typical communist dictatorship. Okay. Besides, because communists have no attraction in the world, the model is no longer valid for influencing other people in the world, not to mention the people in the West. When Khrushchev says, "We will bury you," when he had this kitchen debate with Nixon, at that time, actually, there are a lot of echoes, even in the U.S., not to mention the third world, other countries, because you have a left-wing movement, you have unions, you have even you have these later the generation, anti-war generation, and the civil rights movement. They're actually sympathetic with that view. Okay. Today, I don't believe any socialist or communist model can really compete with market economic model per se. So Chinese will not abandon the strategy of opening, except, of course, what they're trying to do is so-called or more regulated opening, or Xi Jinping's new concept is called systemic opening, systemic opening project. The real danger for democracy is within. China policy, maybe Russian policy, but I'm just saying this is what the Chinese feeling, or my own feeling. China policy is almost hijacked by your domestic politics. Washington is a town where everybody competes who is more hawkish these days. As president, I never believe I will see this day. Anyone become more and more hawkish as getting a political credit. It's absurd situation. China policy is the only handle in Washington, D.C. that can maintain some kind of facade of bipartisanship. Honestly, I do not see any other serious issue. There is a bipartisanship anymore. In Europe, you're pitting your national strategy as an autocracy versus democracy may end up with European countries moving the voters to the right, which is already taking place. Italy, I'm afraid Germany as well, in the end, not to mention several other countries. That's a real danger, real challenge to democracy. I love democracy per se, but democracy is not a software you just put on the machine. It works everywhere. You have to re-identify the root cause. Okay, I'm finished already. So this is where I think China-Russian relationship is unlikely brotherhood because they are not based on ideology at all. There is no ideological talk even between them. So therefore, it's not a autocracy versus a democracy challenge. Okay, I stop here. I'm just talking off my head. Thank you. Thank you. Thank
you want to stay at the podium, or you can maybe sit down?
I sit down.
Yeah, relax a little bit. That's great.
Sorry.
I hope we'll have a lot of great questions from the audience here. Maybe I'll kick things off with one or two, though.
Right.
Lanshin, I was fascinated by your observation that that China already was kind of worried about NATO in the 90s. I find that quite amazing. But in the last few years, even before the war in Ukraine, NATO was already leaning toward the Asia-Pacific. So is that part of Beijing's calculus these days? Did that have a major impact? You know, we saw the British carrier. And one more question, I can't resist asking about where does Belt and Road stand? You know, I mean, if you look at a map, Russia is a big part of Belt and Road. Sure. How is Belt and Road impacted by the war in Ukraine?
Well, the second question is obviously it was impact, but mainly because we had enormous investment in Ukraine before the war. China did not gain much, you know.
Yeah.
Ukraine is the biggest country, or I think we had the biggest investment in the former Soviet sphere. It's Ukraine, Kazakhstan, you know, and so on. So yes, it's not a happy situation, but it did not yet affecting the transit routes. Remember, we have now the freight, you know, on the rail freight, and the many other routes so far has not been greatly affected. Not yet. But also in Central Asian countries, they are not all supporting the war in Ukraine. So they actually want to invite, remember, Central Asia is our focus in this part of the world for the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
So China still get more opportunities to invest or to do things, trade with the Central Asian countries. So, while Africa and many other parts, it's a different story. But they are not quite affected by the war itself. Now, you talk about the NATO members try to show a flag in support of the American Indo-Pacific strategy. I personally do not see Chinese take that too seriously. British in particular. This is a typical British east of Suez, the old dream when the British in such a trouble. I think Chinese understood that. British excessively active in attacking the Hong Kong issue, and the British also claim we are still Far East and Navy power. It's just a nostalgie. Oh no, sorry, it's French called nostalgic.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter that much. Even Americans don't really take that seriously. Austin humiliated British when they sent the carrier to Asia. Right? I was there listening to Austin in Singapore. British is so shocked that Austin said, basically, go home. One carrier here, you better go back defend. There, I mean, the Russians there. So that's not a big deal. The French, if you want me to give you, the French side story is different because the French really is a Pacific power today. But the French still own quite a few islands in South Pacific. So the French are actually making a better case, saying we need Charles de Gaulle to be there. But they are not provoking Chinese in that way, because there is always a special link between Paris and Beijing. We talk behind the scenes, as they say. So, Germany, of course, they don't do very much. So it's not a big deal. Yeah.
Very good.
Sorry.
Right.
Yes.
How about some questions
Yes.
from the audience?
Yeah, sure.
Sir, yes. Go ahead.
Yes.
I have a son who's been working in Shanghai for over a decade.
Well.
And I sort of expressed some concern as a dad in terms of well, you mentioned Germany and Volkswagen having a huge footprint,
right.
Manufacturing footprint in mainland China.
Right.
What is the outlook for either cooperation or strategic retreat of, let's say, big global companies like Volkswagen and others? Are they going to stay, or how do you measure that, and what's the outlook?
Well, outlook actually is not so bad. If you look at what Scholz visit, what he is able to achieve, as the EU strategy, they now says we need to reduce dependency, the level of dependency on China market. That's the official line. Every EU member is supposed to agree. But then each country has their own way of doing their things. For example, Scholz went there. Well, he got 190 Airbus, right? I mean, that's also important for. And he got a breakthrough for the Pfizer, because Chinese for 3 years of the COVID, there is no foreign vaccine there. It's supposed to be a good, giant market, right? So he has done quite a few things. He has the most important CEOs of Germany there, which means they are intent still to expand things. They're going to cut what? They're going to cut high tech, that's for sure. That's part of the transatlantic deal of high tech control. They don't want to transfer the high tech into China for what American demands as security reasons and so on and so forth. So certain area will be cut, but other area may not. Besides, I think the business community are still relatively confident, even with this war cabinet there. they began to realize that Chinese probably is not going to go back, as Wall Street Journal or some other paper say, go back to planned economy. That is over. There is no chance Chinese will go back to planned economy. I don't see it. I don't see it. They're actually starting opening financial sector. They're opening medical hospital sector. And the most impressive is they're opening tourist sector even. I never thought that this happened too fast. That's a huge business, by the way, because Chinese capital monopolize every travel agency in China for, let's say Europeans are so keen on Chinese because the Europeans are always telling me, please, only 1% of Chinese coming to Europe, it will be overwhelm all our facilities, right? So, but there used to be Chinese travel agency are the ones who organize group trips, organize everything. Main part of the profits goes only to Chinese. Now they open only a couple of weeks ago. So many areas are regulated, but they are opening. Probably opening even bigger. The door will be even bigger, in my view. But other area, depends on which sector you're talking about. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
How do you see the China-Russia relationship developing in Africa?
Personally, I actually have not seen any serious collaboration there, because Russians are doing totally different things. China do infrastructure mainly, and mining, the resources, and also we are doing a lot of agriculture in Africa. 20, 30 years ago, probably no more than 100,000 Chinese in the African continent. Now I was told, I used to run another center called Belt and Road Center. I travel 30% of these countries, which is about 25 countries. So yes, the Russians only do one or two things, you see. They don't have much, we are not overlapping in many areas. So I do not see there is a serious collaboration. Now, it worries Americans, of course. They think, well, China has a base in Djibouti, maybe militarily they're going to do some joint stuff. No, I doubt. It's not going to happen. Yeah.
Interesting question. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering your thoughts about how China views Russia's attacking the infrastructure of Ukraine.
Official line the Chinese made is always, we don't like the idea of attacking civilians, attacking infrastructure, utility facilities. The Chinese all repeat all the time on that. But they're not happy, of course, because remember, a lot of infrastructures built by China after Ukraine become independent. Including, yes, some electronic, plants, and so it is a bad situation. But China, at this moment and in the foreseeable, they will never make it public, say, naming Russia. They only disagree with Russia in principle, they would say, but they will never naming Russia did this. It's not going to happen. Unless U.S.-China relationship somehow improve. Yes, sorry. Do we have? Okay.
So this
Sorry.
unlikely brotherhood, you would argue, is based on...
Sorry, can we get you on the mic?
Yeah.
So this unlikely brotherhood, you would argue, is based on U.S.-China relationship and U.S.-Russia relationship. And in an alternative world, what does a different U.S.-China relationship look like?
Well, let's go back to so-called strategic ambiguity. That will be my suggestion. What Biden administration is doing is pursuing what's called strategic clarity. Clarity means you specify what America is going to do if there is, conflict, Taiwan military action. strategic ambiguity actually worked more than 40 years. I personally, I do not. Chinese understood that logic, and they actually take that logic, strategic ambiguity, as part of the American deterrence. You see, which actually worked. Not deterrence, two sides, both Taiwan and mainland China. That's what Americans been doing the past 40 years until recently they seem to be abandoning this. So when you're abandoning strategic ambiguity, you have a president who supposedly have a tongue slip. Now your tongue slip, one time fine, twice okay, 4 times, right? That's President Biden says, yes, very affirmatively. We're going to defend Taiwan. Meaning we, meaning U.S. military. That's what understood in Beijing. Say, well, of course you have Jake Sullivan walk it back 4 times, but where is the credibility when you have this kind of statement all the time? So they need to seriously discuss what your intention is on Taiwan. Let's put this thing on the table. I must say Chinese policymakers still have some grudging, I know maybe you don't like to hear, grudging admiration of Mr. Trump, even today. However crazy he may be, Trump put his cards on the table. You see, he is not using this very vague language, and Trump is not talking about ideology at all, right? Okay, he ended up, because of COVID, he gone crazy. He using Kung Fu flu, this kind of racist attack on China. But otherwise, we can deal. The Chinese elite will say we can deal with Trump. We cannot. We don't know how to deal with Biden. You see that? You understand what I'm trying to say here? Yeah. Okay. Please, yes.
Yeah, Kissinger, I will speak of.
Oh, sorry, let's
Yes,
hit the
yes.
microphone.
Can we have a mic?
We want to make sure people online.
Yes.
Henry Kissinger, I will speak of balance of the power
Yeah.
is essential for world peace.
Right.
Now, since the fall of Berlin Wall,
Yes.
there has been only one world power.
Yeah.
So it seems to be intrinsically unstable.
Right.
And so now the Chinese partner with the Russians. And you think the system will be more balanced? Maybe paradoxically, will be less chance for world war.
Yes. No, that's very good IR theory question, of course. Yes, I think it's a good somebody can restrain any headstrong power. There is a need to restrain China. We recent years we have something called a wolf warrior diplomacy, which for me is absurd. Okay, I'm a leading critic on that. You can still find my long interview in Chinese, but of course then translate by the Canadians into English and French. So almost 10-page interview attacking that. But that means Chinese also in recent years become quite headstrong. Overestimate, in my view, their own capacity. So you need somebody, to restrain. And in this area, United States actually is necessary, and the Europeans have done even better job in that area. Scholz, you can see Scholz visit this time. The Europeans are playing this game very, very well. Unlike the U.S., I put it a very simple way. You talk about human rights. You go to China, you say, what's your problem, so on and so forth. The American approach has always been State Department publish every year a document, name each country, poking everybody in the eye. Is that useful? No, there's no effect. So this is, I think, yes, unipolar world is a fantasy anyway, but American made a mistake, I think. They entertained unipolar fantasy too much. They believe when the Cold War ended, that's all leading to the NATO enlargement, all these decisions. It's a kind of triumphalism. Remember Fukuyama, kind of argument, end of history. Even Fukuyama himself doesn't believe it anymore. Yes. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm wondering whether you think that structural changes might affect China-Russia relations in the future. For example, would Russia worry about, for example, China taking advantage of a weaker Russia as it rises? Thank you.
Well, this has been a thesis almost more than 20 years. You know, especially the Russian nationalists have been making that argument. I understand the Russian fear, especially Chinese migration, because there was a major depopulation trend in the far eastern part of Russia. Right? They lost a lot of population, moved to European side. Then they're facing Heilongjiang province, one province, that's almost 100 million people there. So imagination is that just a small portion of that cross the Amur River that, you know, they're going to colonize. No. I actually listened to Putin personally says that is a fantasy. You know, Chinese, think about this, Chinese will never be able to do that, not causing a war with Russia. Why they want to. So is Russia junior partner? That's been American thesis for a long time, but they underestimate one important thing, that not only Russia is still the top military power, one of the, well, until Ukraine war, we still think it's number 2, right? Military power, fully nuclear, you know, but also Russian economy and Chinese economy are basically complementary to each other to the extent more than any other, you know, bilateral trade relationship. Russian sells anything to China, Chinese would like to have. Now, two things, resources and the weapon. Because Russian produce bad consumer goods nobody wanted anyway, right? So, and the China selling consumer goods, manufacturing products. And in Russia has a, you know, that's also a very big market there. Okay. So it's not that a junior partner as they imagined. Yes.
Let me ask a quick question, if you don't mind. You can give the microphone here, but just, you know, Lanchin, your background is so impressive, and you have an experience that many of us don't have. To be very candid, I don't think any of us have been in the room with Vladimir Putin, whereas you have been in a room, okay, maybe a few people. You've been in the room with Putin many times, so one question I think many of us would ask you is, you know, how do you assess this person as a leader? How does he, you know, many of us are afraid that he could be, you know, becoming irrational, you know, and this is a man who has the finger on the button. Second question is, again, given your incredible experience and knowledge of diplomacy, how do you see the war ending? Easy questions.
No. Up until the war, I usually see him once or twice a year, Vladivostok and Sochi. Now, my basic impression is, to use the word cold-blooded, if it's not too bad. Yes, he is cold-blooded, but an extraordinarily rational person. Sharpness. He can answer any question you raise. I never imagined our leader, I mean Chinese, would even answer a question that way, right? Because Chinese like to behave like an emperor, you know, rather than as a political leader. Remember, Chinese elite also have a grudging admiration of Putin, not just the Xi Jinping. Remember, Putin was elected. Don't forget, don't ever underestimate that fact. Elected. It's not a rigged election. When you think about Putin come to power, he is actually popularly elected. Now, do they manipulate his power, you know, surprise him? Yes, of course. But the Chinese system, where is the election? Okay, it's not Chatham House, so I stop here. So,
sorry, but
I say it's grudging admiration. That's a reality, including people like me, but also people who work in China. Now, the second question, how the war ended. Nobody knows. My sense, I can only say, based on my sense, probably will end faster than many estimates. What I see what Putin trying to do now is that he seems to have triggered a mechanism. Most Russian experts in the US or military experts do not pay too much attention. I don't know if you agree with me, a concept called escalation management strategy, which has been with Russian Joint Chief of Staff for over 30 years. They actually start formulating that strategy since the Afghan war, since their Afghan war. How to manage escalation for the purpose to de-escalate. Okay, that's the concept of Chief of Staff. Americans, nobody take that seriously because U.S. never had that thing. What you had in the Vietnam War and other war, Afghanistan, you call the surge, which is escalation of war. You don't do escalation of management for the purpose of de-escalate. Meaning de-escalate here means you force the other side, sit down to the table, eventually talk about it. Okay. That's what Putin is heightened this tension so high. I think the several steps we will continue to see. He will reach the highest point of even shoot a couple of weapons, nuclear weapons, not on Ukraine, but somewhere else, maybe Arctic, I don't know, just to heighten that threat. And the bet, the Russian side, the bet is Europe cannot sustain this winter, not just the gas and so on. Economically, it's going to be difficult. Look at Scholz's visit this time. One important thing Scholz said is we don't like bloc politics, which is exactly what Americans seem to be doing. Now, as for a German leader to say that, we're not taking sides between China and, U.S., this is not Angela Merkel, this is Scholz. Okay? Merkel, I understand, but Scholz say that. So it's a European, transatlantic, that's what I'm trying to say. Transatlantic solidarity on Ukraine is going to crack. This is the calculation. May work. I don't know.
On a similar note, how is the Western reaction on Russia's war in Ukraine have implications for China and Taiwan? And do you think that's why these projections are now going to be accelerated? Are we just delaying the inevitable?
Sorry, I'm a little. You said, can you just summarize very quickly what's your question? I'm sorry, I did. Yeah.
You're good. So, I guess now that Finland and Sweden are planning on joining NATO, what are the implications for China potentially attacking Taiwan in the future?
You mean Ukraine join NATO? You talking about?
No, it's Finland and Sweden.
Oh, Finland, Sweden. No, that's a totally different scenario. Finland, Sweden. If I were Finns, I would do Finland in particular. It's a natural development, but you try to say how that affected the China-Taiwan policy. Mm-hmm. No, Taiwan policy is totally different. It's an island. It's not a giant country like Ukraine. Plain. There is no mountain even in Ukraine, right? If there is a war, it would be completely different kind of warfare. Besides, Chinese position has always been this is a continuation of civil war. This is not even by international law. Taiwan has no legal status in whatever sense. So I would not think the NATO enlargement this time had any impact on Chinese strategic and military planning at all. I do not believe Chinese are very keen on that. They want to avoid military solution as much as they can. But they worry about the U.S. Expediting that trend. Maybe today's Nancy Pelosi, well, if Blinken goes there, I'm pretty much sure we'll trigger something far more serious. No, I'm just saying. It looks, they believe this is what the U.S. is doing. So
maybe I can follow up that question. with another point. I mean, as I've seen it, you know, NATO and the United States have
Yeah.
demonstrated a lot of
Yeah.
of new weaponry, and you know, the use of intelligence, for example, in kind of strategic ways, targeting and so forth. And I wonder, do you think that? I mean, I think the conventional wisdom here is that this is kind of a strong deterrence message to China.
You mean the recent exposure of Chinese strategic forces? These bases is what they actually publish it. All the Chinese missile sites base is what you're referring to? No,
I'm referring more toward.
Okay.
You know, a kind of sense that, for example, the HIMARS system.
Right.
We've talked. Actually, Asia Pacific specialists know about HIMARS a long time ago because it's already talked about in the Asia Pacific context. So the question is, you know, do you think China's leaders are kind of sobered by what they've seen, or, as you put it, that's an interesting idea. You said that it's an island, so it's totally different.
Yeah, Taiwan already get anti-missile, system. They get 6 battalion. I try to remember how many. They already had the anti-missile system on the island. I do not believe it added that much of the deterrence value as Mr. Austin, General Austin, tried to say.
Yeah.
He used the term integrate deterrence. Has this kind of high-tech platform of this. Don't forget Chinese high-tech also as a countermeasure. Chinese, especially in terms of, for example, HIMARS' deadly enemy, of course, is the drones. You don't, you cannot detect drones. I mean, it's especially the concept of what do you call the mass deployment of drones. There was a swarm. Yes.
Yeah.
China can easily produce a huge supply of high-tech swarm drones. Now, for the ocean, for let's say Navy side, which Pentagon already recognized the underwater, the what do you call this? An unmanned vehicle, right? These unmanned vehicle which actually can live under there like a little bug. Lived there for 5 years. With the Chinese had that kind of, I don't know, some kind of batteries. I try to. You're the experts on military things, but well, in any case,
I think you're right.
They suspect the Chinese already had that technology. You have all these things under the water, so when the American ships there at any time, they would be able to attack, and also for the reconnaissance, they would know American. It was high precision. So China is not Russia in that sense. Yeah. Russian military weapon system, surprisingly, is quite backward, except the long-range missiles and maybe supersonic, that sort of stuff. The other stuff are not great. So it's different. Yeah, I think it's very different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, we've covered a lot of ground. If some people need to leave early, we have another 15 or 20 minutes. So I think, we have an incredible expert here. So please, if you have some questions, don't be afraid. Tee it up,
yes.
Sir.
Do you think the war could be ended just like the Korean War, never stop, but
personally, if you ask my personal opinion, Korean War ended up with Panmunjom ceasefire agreement, which is good. Ceasefire still is a ceasefire, not peace treaty, but still lasted, 65 years, right? Even though they never resolved problem. But I doubt there will be a ceasefire agreement. What I see it, Putin will be satisfied, I may be wrong here, if it's a Kashmir solution. Good enough for him. Kashmir means line of control, kind of, because nobody is going to recognize the four sham, referendum. No matter how good relation between China and Russia, I've been telling Russian friends, don't expect Chinese to publicly recognize at the UN. That's like a North Korean Kim actually recognize that's part of Russia. China can never do that. So nobody, including China, will deny the legitimacy of that four republics, right? I mean, so the best thing to do is line of control. Maybe continued friction, but no war. Okay, India and Pakistan, Kashmir. Remember, India and Pakistan had several clashes over the Kashmir. Had one serious little war, but on the whole, it holds. I mean, it's not that bad. That's my view. I may be wrong. I may be wrong. I will say both Ukraine and Russia probably end up satisfied. Because Ukraine will continue to assert we don't lose territory. We don't recognize it. So that may be the case.
Can you comment on
Yes.
India? And, there was an article in the New York Times, I don't know if you saw it today, where they said India could be a mediator in the Ukraine war, and that raised the question of China as a mediator. But a deeper question about India is how has the war and India's position on the war somehow improved India's relationship with China, seemingly, because they have something
Quite
in
a
common?
lot, yes, certainly quite a lot. Not just because India's view or India's attitude on this war, but also there is another reason is that the Indian distanced itself from what American called the Indo-Pacific strategy. Remember, that's the only thing Americans seem to have worked out in the more concrete sense, so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. But India, of course, defending its own national interests. You know, saying you see, Indo-Pacific strategy is, for me, it's almost like a ridiculous concept, because Indo-Pacific, the extreme eastern side, western side of the Pacific is the United States. The Indian Ocean side is India. That's the two major players are not a major player even in the region of Indo-Pacific economic activities. They both reject the TPP or CTPP, the CTAP, and several other economic. Then American proposed some framework of economic cooperation. They put up something like 800 million. It's almost like a joke. They gave Ukraine 60 billion. They create a new economics, 800 million or something. It's absurd. So India has no interest seriously jump on that Indo-Pacific strategy. That's the point. That's the reason more important for improving the relationship. Yeah.
Hi.
Yes.
You mentioned quite a bit about Chinese technical superiority over Russia.
Yeah, okay. You talk about okay.
Military,
never say everything.
technical
Okay, go ahead.
superiority, specifically about drones. And you mentioned, why there would not be a transfer of drones from China to Russia. I'm wondering, do you think the same logic applies to cyber attacks that would be harder to detect? Or do you think that that is something slightly different? And if you do think it's something different, why do you think that we are seeing this abject cybersecurity failure from Russia's side in the Russia-Ukraine war? And why isn't China helping in ways that could be more surreptitious?
Well, but the Russians, but remember on the cyber side, Russians are dealing with Elon Musk. So it's a very different kind of technology. The Russian has no, they couldn't deal with unless they shoot down. I mean, that's. But the Elon Musk project, if you know, Starlink is a project contracted with Pentagon, but it's a private company as well. So Ukrainians, they can use the private company. So Russian cannot do much about the Starlink as far as I can see it. This is something very, very different. Now, say China help. How can China help Russians in the space, or what do we do to help Russia to detect Ukraine target for Russians to? No, it just doesn't make any sense there. If Huawei going to do that, of course Huawei will lose every contract in the world, not just the U.S., Europe. No, it's not possible for Chinese to help Russia that way. No way. I don't see it. Yeah.
Well,
you agree?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean in terms of defense. I meant in terms of attacks, which I think can be harder to disguise. It can be easier to disguise.
You mean Russian cyber attack against Ukraine?
Yes.
But remember, the Starlink, it's very useful to detect a lot of things. Now, you cannot, if you cannot attack a Starlink, it does not work. You can bring down some cyber infrastructure in Ukraine, the older ones, but you cannot touch the new ones they are using. See, militarily, that's what the reality is, as far as I can see. But anyway.
Just for that question, do you think the Ukraine war should be avoided?
Should have been, yes. Could have been, in fact, yes.
So what went wrong?
What went wrong? My understanding.
And are there lessons for the Asia Pacific?
Of course, there are lessons. What went wrong is diplomacy. Yes, that's my view. They could have made a deal over this Minsk tool. Basically, it's Minsk tool that break down, which means neutrality. Just Ukraine pledge neutrality. What's wrong with neutrality? Switzerland been doing that for 100 years, and nobody attacked. It's a perfect situation for Ukraine to accept that. Zelensky, my understanding is actually is warm to the idea, even shortly before the war started. But he had some hope that the Russians will not do it, actually. You remember, they don't believe American intelligence, the Zelensky people. So it's unfortunate. It is unfortunate, yes.
Can you comment on? Sorry, I have about 1 million questions. So, but please, if raise your hands. But I would like to ask questions all the way up till 5:30. But my question. Okay, one second.
Okay,
quickly. How about the Korean Peninsula and Japan? They, you seem to have an increase of tensions since February. Are they?
You mean between whom? You mean between? China or
kind
Russia?
of across the board, but with Russia, but also potentially with China. Like a consolidation of, if you will, of bipolarity in the Asia Pacific? Do you think? Does that concern you, or?
Yes, I think certainly concerned. The key here is South Korea. I would say what South Korea is going to do. The new president certainly moved much closer to a tougher position, try to deal with the North. But I don't see South Korean government can sustain that position for too long, because the Kim is not irrational, but he certainly become a little crazy this year about look at the frequency of his. It could end up with some accident, military, conventional military accident between North and South Korea. So I don't think South Korean leadership will, continue that kind of provocative from North point of view. They will end up try to find some way to talk to the North leaders.
Some have said Kim Jong-un is one of the biggest beneficiary of the Ukraine war.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. He actually sent weapons to Russia, that we know, and he probably even say, let's even send a volunteer. Well, Korean military is not bad. North Korean military actually is very good, and extremely well trained, tough, fighters. I believe the Russians say no, because you're not Caucasian-looking people. You have all the Asians going there, just like Chinese asked Russians help during the Korean War in the 50s. Stalin said, no, we can only provide advices. We never go to the front. Because you look European, right? So the American will start World War III with us. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. This is more of a question regarding domestic situations in China.
Yes.
So now that the Chinese economy is kind of slowing down because of its COVID policies, the housing market, decline in export competitiveness, and the U.S. and its allies trying to transfer the supply chain away from China.
Yes.
So how do you see the government trying to maintain its legitimacy, given that their primary source of legitimacy is undergoing some serious challenges, and that currently the control of domestic political narratives is definitely one of the ways that they're using. But do you see other alternatives? And if there is no alternative, how long do you think it'll last?
You mean alternative form of government? Or
No.
about
Alternatives
policy?
of maintaining its legitimacy. And if there is no alternative, if they keep doing what they're doing currently, how long do you think the strategy is going to last?
Okay, well, I wrote the recent book. It's about legitimacy. So if you want my view, no, I define legitimacy entirely different from what the Western political science theory about what legitimacy is. Right? I rather go back to Confucian tradition to in the West. You want okay? I give you I don't want to get carried away. In the West, legitimacy is defined by space, basically. That's since the classic Greece, as you know. You know, democracy, politics actually defined as a polis. It's always defined as a little area you can measure. So polis, then democracy, and so on and so forth. Chinese never had a space concept about politics and legitimacy. That's, you know, what they are doing. It's a time is important. Well, it's not space, but time. It's a dynamic process. Legitimacy defined by actual performance of each government, whoever they are, which government, emperor or man or woman, usually men in Chinese history, but a couple of wonderful women emperors. Now, if you can deliver what you promise, that is legitimacy. Now, you may not be able to deliver 100%, but even 6%, 70%, what you promise, you have no problem. But if you cannot deliver, overthrow the government in China, the form of regime change has always been popular rebellion against government. This is how so-called dynastic changes in China. Confucius is not conservative politician. I'm the one trying to rehabilitate him. He is the first person actually support the idea of legitimating popular rebellion against morally incorrect government. So therefore, from that perspective, you need to define if the current regime in China, in Beijing, have they delivered? Is this morally bankrupt? Or what? Now, before you're doing that, then you can say, what's the alternative? What's the difficulty? Yes, economy, certainly we're running into difficulties. But from double-digit growth to 5 or something, you say that's a major crisis. I would say a little exaggeration to say that's an economic crisis, right? We haven't reached that point yet. Besides, the COVID policy is winding down. Once that happens, rebound of all the activities will be surprising. So I have not seen one-party system at this moment running its course yet. Okay, that's my argument. Without defending the government, I don't have to defend particular person and so on. I have not seen yet. I have not seen yet.
But in physics, like space and time cannot be dissociated.
Sure, yes, that's what mechanical. That's exactly mechanical. That's why Western political philosophy say divisions of power. You see, power actually can be divided into 3 spaces. That's the I attack a lot in my book of Montesquieu. I blame everything on Montesquieu in the end. It's absurd from Chinese logic. You cannot divide power into 3 compartment spaces. You want to keep a balance? You have to have a government who behave morally correct. take care of people in general, right? When you have a people in the country who split like this way, I'm sorry, I love the United States, but I did not believe I have a chance to see this. The country divide right in the middle. I haven't seen that in history since 1860. So there's
Maybe I
something
can
breakdown.
let me ask a related question just to close out the session here. Speaking of moral legitimacy, arguably the Putin regime is facing, you know, a very difficult situation, and many, I think, many Russians and many around the world would posit that the regime is morally bankrupt. So, the question to you is, you know, how does China react if the situation in Moscow becomes much more even tenuous? If the Kremlin is facing a regime-threatening crisis, what does China do? Does it?
I basically say I will say nothing. What can they do? It's nothing. That, you know, they cannot even help Putin if Putin lost populism. But remember, Putin was elected with 80%. Okay, he may lost another 20 or maybe even 30% now, but still he is above average compared with any politicians in the world. So I don't know. If that did not happen, unless there is a coup d'etat, that's a different issue here. If there is a serious coup d'etat.
Is this something people in Beijing are talking about in Shanghai or no?
I think they talk about it, but how can you predict? You know, before Chinese Party Congress, there are even books in the West saying the sensational story about coup d'etat against Xi Jinping, but it's all imagination anyway. These are all imaginations, but difficult to.
Hi, sorry, the one question is online. So the person want to ask based on your arguments, he or she think the monetary, the currencies world rising. So is right or not right?
You mean Chinese? Which currency rising? U.S. versus Chinese. Is that what I say?
He not mentioned the. What country, but just the mention is the multi-currencies world well rising. So, he's correct or not?
Well, the recent phenomenon is the US dollar versus RMB rise quite a bit, but that's because of Federal Reserve policy. It's rising against euro, rise. Only they did not rise against the Swiss franc. I'm happy. Because I'm on Swiss payment, so. But what's the problem then? It's affecting Chinese economy because the rising of the dollar. It's what.
Yeah, and he impediment 1 cent. The 1 sentence. So he's saying that China and Russia are doing the huge projects in outer space. So.
Joint project in space. We don't have an official joint space project, except we use each other's space station, you know, sometimes. I don't believe we have a real joint projects there. Maybe I'm wrong. Do we have
I think there is the moon discussion. How much it's been put in concrete, I think, is still unclear. But I think we've come to the end of our session. Thanks to those online who stuck with us, and thanks to the audience here for putting the time in. We did a lot of hard work, but I think we learned a lot from Professor Xiang, who, as you can see, is an incredible expert. So we'll hope you come back and visit again. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoy it. Excellent questions. Yes.
What was once unthinkable, a direct conflict between the United States and China, has now become a discussion, a commonplace discussion in the national security community. A Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan might not be the most probable future event, but it's certainly the most dangerous. Our project designed a war game to model a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan in 2026. We ran it 24 times in a wide variety of scenarios. Although Taiwan survived as an autonomous entity, in most scenarios, losses to the United States, Taiwan, Japan, and China were enormous. At today's event, we'll discuss the war game and the insights that arise from it. With our panelists, we'll also discuss some of the broader issues about the U.S.-China conflict, potential conflict, and wargaming. I'd like to note that this event is made possible by a generous grant from Smith Richardson Foundation. We appreciate their support. Before we go further, I'm required to make an announcement that in the unlikely event of an emergency, I will give instructions about what we should do. We will either evacuate the building to the front or to the rear. Our event today, we're going to have 4 parts. The first part